Welcome to the show, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're joined by Alison Eastaway. Alison is currently the VP of People and Culture for Push Security. So, Alison, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Really do appreciate it. So, what was it like growing up in Australia?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think Australia, particularly, I was born in the 80s, spent most of my childhood through the 90s, which is pre-internet, right? Or at least pre-internet at home. That came in when I was in high school. Australia is pretty isolated from the world. So a lot of my childhood was, not to over idealize, hindsight's always 2020 on that, but a lot of outside time, a lot of time with my head in a book, traveling, as best I kind of could, because I always sort of had this sense that there was a bigger world out there, or things were happening in places that weren't Australia, whether it was the movies we watched on TV or the TV shows where everything was happening in America. It was snowy at Christmas, and, whereas for us it was 40 degrees Celsius and, on a beach at Christmas. So I think it was always this kind of disconnect around, the pop culture and the things we're getting from a place, even American high schools or the movies, a place that wasn't sort of our reality. And so I think I always had this curiosity around, what's happening out there in the rest of the world. And then the internet obviously broke that wide open. I had dial-up internet at home, I guess, when I would have been 15. So the last couple of years of high school, and, really the wild west of the early MySpace days and ICQ and things like that. I think there's a bunch of things about me that are really inherently Australian that I don't think I realized until I left Australia, first for France and then later for the United States. I think at the time I just felt like we were probably quite far from a lot of things that were mentioned in books or on TV shows.
What do you think are some of the biggest differences between Australian culture and US culture? I know US
Yeah,
culture is kind of a loaded, I mean, because there's so many different, I feel like cultures within the United States, which is one of the things that I think makes this country really cool. But um, yeah, what would you say are like some of the biggest differences?
Yeah, it's so interesting, and you're right. I certainly wouldn't dare to try and summarize US culture. I've been in the US full time for a year and a half, but have been working with French American companies for, the last decade, and traveling a lot to San Francisco and New York, and, even comparing New York culture to San Francisco culture, or the Midwest or anywhere else would be,
Or Miami?
you
Have you been to Miami?
know, yeah,
It's like a different
I have,
country, like totally different,
exactly.
right?
Exactly. So,
Yeah,
I think there's kind of no one size fits all. And I also think I did most of my culture shock from Australia to France.
really?
And so then the move from Paris to New York, it felt much more like a homecoming. And I think that obviously comes down to, the same default language and things like that. There's a lot of different cultural things, as it comes down to sort of your work-life balance, or even, the way benefits are done, Australia, and you kind of can't overstate this, Australia and France have universal healthcare. I have never, you grow up as a kid in Australia, your biggest concern about healthcare is that something happens to you in a remote place and it takes a while for an ambulance or a helicopter to get to you, right? And we're talking about pretty dangerous, animals and snakes and spiders and things like that. So in Australia, you grow up being very educated about what to do if something happens and you can't get an ambulance there quick enough, right? So like we all go through this kind of basic survival training of snake bites or spider bites and things like that, that just see when, all of us know how to swim and how to, in theory, dive in and rescue a friend and do CPR before you graduate, the equivalent of middle school. So that's just a real reflection of kind of that climate. Moving to the US, obviously, one of the starkest things is understanding that most people in New York City would take an Uber to the hospital, not an ambulance. And that's just really reflective of, I guess, the system and the things you take for granted. I obviously moved to the city recently. I asked a friend, I said, who's your primary care physician? They've been here a decade. They don't have one. Why? Oh, I try to avoid going to the doctor unless it's a real emergency. Okay, interesting. Those are obviously top of mind, because when you think about sort of then flow on decisions, the US obviously has relatively low protections for employees. France has some of the highest in the world. So I think some of those things then in France, if you leave a job, you have a 3-month notice period for sort of white collar work. If you think in the US, at will employment in most states, the way people think about their careers and their lives and what security means, and therefore where they're willing to make a change or prioritizing stability, it just looks totally different depending where you're at. Yeah, so I think it's been a bunch of those things, and then you see the flow on with entrepreneurship and how that then leads to people taking more or less risk in their life based off, some of the social systems that back it up.
So you said you worked for a few like French American. What's it like? And we've worked. I have a lot of experience working with international companies, but I think from your perspective, did you see like differences? Okay, if you have your office in Paris and you have the office in New York or San Francisco, how do you think those like how did those cultures work together? Did you see massive disconnects or
Yeah.
I mean, what was it or not? I mean, maybe you didn't, right? Because like the culture of the company was like, of like-minded people. So I'm curious what that was like.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think a lot of the ideas about what the French are like in a work environment are a lot of them are true. A lot of them don't translate into the tech startup industry. So the number one thing people know about France is that people get a lot of holidays and don't work long hours. That's what people tend to think of in France.
Hmm.
Now, again, back to social systems, they have huge income and employment protection and great healthcare and things like that. So it's almost a security of the system that allows people to prioritize life over work. But what it creates is a small group of people who are ambitious and hungry for more and something else, which usually leads most of them into the tech industry because that's where there is, opportunities for outsized effort to equal outsized results. And for French companies or French startups or European startups in general, looking to take things next level after seed or maybe Series A stage, they end up in the US because that's where the investment is and the talent and the growth. The European ecosystem is incredible. I spent 12 years helping develop it. I'm very bullish on companies being born out of Europe. Push Security was born in the UK and South Africa. And I think great things
Cool.
can be started elsewhere. I think the acceleration is still in the US.
100%.
What we found between France and California was the time difference is painful, but happily, French people will work late and Californians will work early, and then the opposite isn't true. So thank God it's in that direction.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think like so many of us in tech, it's like you do have to be on, like you have to be available to some extent working in multiple time zones. It's interesting. A lot of French companies, I do see them in SF, and it's like kind of interesting. They don't just pick New York. Um,
It's such an interesting question. It's what are you optimizing for? Where are your
right.
customers? Who are you selling to? I think if a decent part of your customers are in the financial services or banking space, East Coast makes total sense. I think if the majority of your customers are tech companies, which is a lot of the earlier stage companies, if you think through like the Y Combinator program, things like that, or selling to other high growth tech startups, for sure it's the West Coast. And then
Yeah.
obviously everything in between if you're selling to industry and things like that. I also think the talent density in New York, of my 10 closest friends, two of them work in tech. And in San Francisco, of everyone, I can't think of an exception of people I'm friendly with in SF who don't work in tech. So I think there's also that,
Hmm.
pros and cons, diverse, and look quite probably controversially. In San Francisco, there's you can understand how a lot of startups get born. There's not that much to do on a weeknight in San Francisco. In New York City, the world's your oyster 24 hours a day. So I can kind of see arguments, half a dozen one way and six the other. So yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, that's really cool. And so you mentioned like the mindset is different around work in a few different ways in Australia, and I think you had mentioned that it's a little different in terms of how people think about like bachelor's degrees versus like work experience, and how does that trend like? So, what are the differences between how people think about it in Australia and the United States? And I know it's probably evolved over the last several
Yeah.
years too, but I mean, what are the differences there?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, my experiences, rapidly out, probably getting out of date. The more distance between my university aged years and now. But Australia, if you take the three countries where I spent most of my life and career, Australia, France, and the United States. The United States obviously has the most expensive higher education program, very common for individuals to take on significant student loan debt to fund, the most basic of degrees, the most affordable of degrees. France, it's almost entirely free. So in France, everybody, more or less without exception, gets a 5-year master's degree because it is largely free. And it is also because everyone has one. that is the well trod path. And to not have it is really to sort of set yourselves up, at least that's how they see it, for failure. Australia hits something of a middle ground. Australians are incredibly pragmatic. Australians tend to have jobs. It used to be 14 and 9 months. And then when I was turning 14, they switched that back to 14. You could start working from. And that was very happy for me. So I went and got a job, sort of the day after my 14th birthday. A lot of Americans also work throughout high school and have summer jobs or working on the weekends or after school. France, that doesn't happen. People, there's some exceptions, but generally speaking, French people will be 25 years old, have a master's degree, and have never had to, show up for a shift on time. And it does create really interesting dynamics through the workforce with sort of like for like. You might think, okay, people are of a similar generation, have probably seen similar, things, or have similar basics sort of under their belt. And a 25-year-old from Australia, myself at the time, would have had 11 years work experience versus 0 for a French person. That can be really
That's wild to think about. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's, and, a lot of those skills are transferable from, my first job was as a shop assistant in a bakery. And whilst that doesn't look like it has a ton to do with a job in tech, there's a bunch of sort of baseline skills that are definitely transferable. And I think that's what's interesting as well. But yeah, different kind of mentalities around whether a degree is the only way to access a profession, whether work experience can stand in or replace, or some combination of the above.
I think people who are successful in tech know how to translate experience in other industries
Yeah.
into
I mean,
being successful. Like that adaptability part of it's like learning from whatever industry you started out in or whatever job or right.
yeah, I usually say I've talked to my way into every job I've ever had. And it's largely a question, and I feel like this is a fairly Australian mindset. Again, it always comes back to like labor laws and the setup in the country. In Australia, it's relatively easy to let go of somebody. We have decent safety nets on things, so it's not quite the at will one day to a next sort of set up in the US, but it's relatively easy to stop working with someone. So my pitch would always be, what have you got to lose? We try give it a try for a week. If at the end of the week you're not happy, like we part ways as friends. And that's largely the mindset I've taken into any job I've ever had. If it's not super obvious, to say, hey, look, what's the worst that could happen here? And front load that risk. And that's inherently not a French mindset. It's closer to an American mindset, sort of depending, your mileage may vary, but a little more, let's give it a go. Let's have that appetite for risk. Let's try. And failure, I think, is much more palatable in the US than it is in France, for example.
Really? Can you explain on that a little bit more? So what do you mean like they're like this? Is it from like you just mean a risk perspective? They're worried about failing, or is it like a social
Yeah,
aspect of the perception of failure? Like what is that?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'd say, my experiences, particularly in New York and San Francisco, which might skew a little bit the opinions, but that people are excited if you try something and not necessarily going to sit around and say, oh, didn't you have a business? Whatever happened to that business? Oh God, were you terrible at it? Is that why it shut down? People are much more likely to, socially, to your point, minimize the failure and just be like, yeah, well, good on you for at least trying. A lot of people will go their whole lives without even thinking. So I think there's more, it's a little bit the American dream. It's a little bit the, you can, I guess the version today is if you've got a laptop and Wi-Fi, you can probably, build the future. And I think that idea about it's better to have tried than to sort of die wondering. And that is very inherently not European as a mindset. And so there's a lot of stuff to overcome, I think, for people going into tech and startups in Europe that just isn't, as
Yeah.
present in the US or in Australia.
I think I've actually thought about that a lot, and I wonder it's like why like American culture, even like within the diversity of cultures within America, that's sort of like a common theme across like a lot of folks. And I personally, I think it has something to do that like America's a country of immigrants, like inherently they're risk takers. Like everybody
Yeah.
here left and moved to a new continent,
Yeah.
right? It's like all within the last, either at max few hundred years, but a lot of which a lot sooner. So it's like everybody here has that side to them to some
Hmm.
extent, and I
Oh,
think
yeah.
that's like why we have such a like there's this level of like risk taking that is like deep within our culture and like when you look at all of the different kind of like subcultures within the United States, it's like a very common theme that you'll find. It's like people willing to take risk for a better life, take a
Yeah.
shot. I think that's
Absolutely. And
pretty
then
special. you know?
And I think spotting the opportunity, the work ethic of putting in, saying, yeah, this is probably not going to be easy day one or year one, but there seems to be something here. Let's go for it. Worst case, what we'll have, another door that's opened on that side,
Yeah.
and that mindset, obviously, a bunch of things can influence it, and family obviously being probably the number one factor there around
Yeah.
what you were exposed to, what was okay, what was rewarded, what were the stories that people told, that I think is huge. And I think definitely why the US is still viewed as the key area for opportunity, expansion, acceleration,
Yeah.
career growth. you know
Well, yeah, I mean, just
um
like the general market, right? Like, there's of all of our international customers, doesn't matter if they're like somewhere within Europe, or Israel or India or
yeah,
wherever, right? I mean, it's success is typically defined of like we need to go like conquer essentially the U.S. market. That's
yeah,
where we really need to be to make it big. Um,
absolutely.
it's interesting, but yeah, U.S. culture is interesting too. It's like they're almost like we do to some extent romanticize like the idea of like individualism or entrepreneurship and ambition. I think, at times a little bit too much, but I mean, there's benefits and drawbacks, right? Like, I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I think starting business startups ideas are wonderful, but it's certainly not the only path to success. And it's funny. I was actually just doing career day for my girlfriend's son. He's in fifth grade, and we talked about entrepreneurship, and we were talking about values and virtues and what it means to be a good person. And then we got into like, look, ambition actually is not a virtue. It's not. It's something
Mm,
that makes there's that there are good people who are ambitious, right? But usually entrepreneurs are very ambitious people. But you don't have to be. Entrepreneurship isn't for everyone. In fact, there's other ways to be ambitious. You can be ambitious in how you show up for your family, right? And how
yeah.
you take care of yourself. We don't you have to have such a limited scope in how we think of the definition of ambition. Um,
Yeah.
but it's just interesting. It is interesting cultural. It's like kind of really cool and exciting from a tech perspective, but it's also interesting. Like, it's there's a lot of different ways to make an impact.
Yeah.
A lot a
No, I
lot of
think,
different ways to live life, right?
yeah, and I think, like, you have ambition, but there's also like the concept of excellence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can be really excellent at, any number of things, whether it's the way do your home cooking. You might be like, okay, I want to make the best version of like this day. And I think the reason I think through excellence is that I do think that then translates out. If you're sort of shooting for excellence in one area of your life, it does, it does become a bit of a habit.
Yeah.
And I think like the kind of building blocks for that, or even what I would refer to as like taste or standards for yourself and things like that, do tend to translate. And then ambition can just be around. I tend to think of ambition as, this timeline that someone else laid out on paper. Is there a way of compressing it? Could we get there faster? Could we dream bigger? What would that look like? Which I think is definitely a product of, a decade and a bit in startups and things like that, where you see tiny startups, of less than 100 people challenging massive incumbents who've been around for
Yeah.
20 years. And it does sort of put you into this, is everything figure outable? What is a hard limit that I can't push through? And I do think it does expand the way you then sort of think through what's a hard and fast rule or what can be influenced. And I think that's where sometimes the ambition part can come in, where something might sound super ambitious. I packed up, I left home at sort of 18 and, a minute, and, moved completely to a different country where incidentally I didn't speak the language and hadn't actually really thought about that until I landed and went, oh, right. Might have been useful to figure, but I guess I'm here now and I need to communicate. So we're going to work it out together on that. That wasn't that didn't feel like a big deal for me, because the trade-off was, getting to be a part of this big world that I'd heard about, rather that, the bigger risk for me was staying in Cherrybrook, a tiny suburb of, Sydney's northwest where I grew up. That was the bigger risk, was the
Mm.
kind of trust. I felt like, I would like atrophy and nothing interesting would ever happen to me. So I do think there's kind of like no one size fits all for what risk actually looks like. And sometimes it doesn't look like, the big bold
But yeah,
move that
it'd be
might,
like risk is also there's a correlation between risk and your values and what you
yeah,
associate, like, pain versus success. Or I mean, like, yeah, it's like when you look at it, I mean, I actually like kind of um very similar experiences. Grew up halfway across the world from where you did, but in terms of like my values and how I thought about risk were very similar. It was, my biggest fear was like regret of not going for it, of not being an entrepreneur, of looking back and wishing I had done more. because I felt so passionately about it. So similar story, like I quit, I had worked really, really hard for a job in the States. I didn't have a college degree, and um, I was able to get hired by a publicly traded company that required college degrees, and they ended up making an exception for me. But it was very, very hard, and for a long time they said they wouldn't do it. Um, but they did. I ended up getting an interview with the president of the company. Turns out he
Oh
was
wow.
the only other person there without a degree. Uh,
Yeah.
so, you know, go figure. But so he ended up like, giving me a shot. But then it's like at 23, it's like I quit my job and moved to a new country, didn't speak the language.
Yeah.
I kind of did that path too, but it was always looking through the lens of like, I feared the long-term consequences of not trying to live my life to the fullest versus the short-term consequences of being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. I was willing to be uncomfortable because the pain of the long term was greater than the pain of the short term. I feel like such an important concept for people to think about when it comes to accomplishing anything you want. Like most things that are fulfilling or a lot of the things that we need to do to better ourselves can be uncomfortable in the short to mid term. So it's like we have to kind of flip that on its head and say, okay, like make the pain of not doing something and the long term
Yeah.
greater. It's like, like it's anything. It's like eating healthy, right? Like people don't want to do it because in the short term it's like, I don't want to do it, but long term it's like if you can make the pain of being unhealthy in the long term greater than the short term of not making an adjustment now with like working out or whatever else, like that's how you end up being successful. Anyways, yeah, you just the way you were saying it just made me kind of think about this because I've thought about it, and I think it really is a definition of like something that is shared among successful people is they're able to make the pain of something long term and push it to the present and feel it in the present, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I
I
think
don't,
like yeah, it's an interesting concept. I think so I taught English as a foreign language to both initially it was my first job in France
nice.
to French people looking to speak English, and Fortune 500 company CEOs and things like that. Ministers in the French government, but I also taught nurses and recent arrivals to Australia, Korean and Japanese nurses as well, English. And it's really interesting when you start teaching some of the tenses. What you ask to explain it, you sort of say, oh, it'll be 6 p.m. by the time he gets here. That's a very complex structure to teach as a second language because you're projecting forward to the future and then looking backwards. And it's kind of the parallel that I have whenever I'm sort of thinking about, path A or path B. It's like, okay, well, what if I could project forward to the, best possible outcome of, path A or best possible outcome of part B, and then work backwards. How would I feel about it now? Projecting to that future point. And I think it's kind of that. It's like, how do you then assess, best case scenario, all things being equal,
That's a
which would
really good example. I love that. I'm gonna start using
it's a
that.
yeah, it's a good like mental exercise. But and then I think there's also the idea of agency. Yes, I'm definitely an ambitious person. Like I'm much more comfortable with that term now, but I would have always said I'm like very like action oriented, high agency. And if anything is physically within my power to shift and do and change, I'm going to do the thing rather than wait. And I
Yeah.
think often some of those bigger moves are like, well, I could not change my diet and see how things pan out, or I could just like make this small tweak. And you're like, oh, well, I did a thing rather than waited and didn't do a thing. So that's always appealed to me. It's like having it's probably just a control issue that, probably certainly has downsides, but at the very least has led to some, very good career things along the way.
I love it. Hey, so when was like I don't know the right way or when to segue into this, but I'm curious. I'm just gonna do it now. Can you tell us about you did this like uh WSET like testing or like wine education? Like when
Yeah.
did you do that? And can you tell us more about that? I just find that like super interesting. I'm just curious to hear what that was all
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had a bunch of different jobs, and probably have one of the jumpiest sort of CVs in the game, if that's what we're looking at. Thankfully, haven't used my CV to get a job in, probably the better part of a decade, and hopefully
There's a
don't ever
lesson
need
there. There's a lesson there for everybody
to.
tuning in.
100%. But I think everybody in tech or startups who's been doing this for a little while occasionally steps back from the computer, the Zoom call, the whatever sort of virtual tool and world and AI that we live in, and goes, "Oh, what would be the after plan? Imagine that this thing we're building makes it really big, and money is no longer the main object that you're thinking through, and your all your needs are met for whether it's 6 months or longer on that, what then would I do? And it's a useful thought experiment. A lot of people in tech end up landing on some version of the cozy cafe somewhere in the woods sort of fantasy life, which is entirely offline and simpler things. And most of us, myself included, probably the reality won't ever match up to the fantasy. But I worked for sort of 3 tech startups in rapid succession, the third of which happened to be a really great success, and we sold in a strategic acquisition to a much bigger tech company. Right sort of after the second wave of the pandemic. So in sort of 2021, after sort of a crazy
Best
few
time to sell
years,
for sure.
in cybersecurity, it certainly was, and had,
Yeah.
I'd like to say we timed it, but no, it was just a, great
Just happened.
conflation of things. Yeah. So came out of a very intense virtual and incredibly stressful for HR and talent professionals. We largely were carrying entire companies and industries sort of anxiety and trying to also function and navigate a genuinely never before seen situation. So came out of that with a little bit of time, a little bit of money, and certainly a touch of burnout, and said, what would I do now? Said to myself, take 6 months off. I think I took 2. And then I find, tech people, particularly operators, we can be it's almost tunnel vision. That's what it's required to get everything done. It's like focus. You hear people say lock in, things like that. The second you sort of step back, whether it's a longer break or things, it's your periphery that opens up. And I think for me, the things I started to notice, I was like, okay, well, what am I really good at? What are my core skills? And what do I absolutely not want to do for a little bit? I didn't want to be on a video call. I think at the time I said, I'll never take another video call again. Hyperbole. I didn't want to, I previously traveled a lot. I said, I kind of want to be in one fixed location. And I don't particularly want to we just come out of solving these problems nobody had ever solved before, that now sound really run of the mill, but at the time, we were deciding, where the government fell short. We were deciding, do you reopen offices and put people's lives at risk? Or are you being, excessively cautious? Are you being dramatic? Is this actually, you're often the one person who decided things that could have very far reaching consequences. So I didn't really want to make consequential decisions. I wanted to solve easy problems. And all of that kind of came together where I went, oh, what I'm talking about is brick and mortar retail. I want to be in a fixed place. I don't want to be on a video call. I want to solve a problem that's more or less intellectually easy to understand, which is what should we drink tonight? And so I opened, and also with my startup brain, there was a gap.
I just love how you explain that.
It really was the process, right? And
solve an easy problem. I want to solve something that's what should we drink
I didn't want anyone coming to me with anything other than, I'm making, a spaghetti vongole tonight. What goes with it? Great. I've got this person I'm trying to impress. What bottle can I take? I've got 10 euros. What can I get? Kind of thing. That was the level of where I needed to exist. And there was a gap in the market, which is that women buy the majority of wine, like any household good. English, there's a lot of English-speaking, immigrants and expats in Paris, and most of the wine stores I would go to as a customer would either speak down to me because I was female or a foreigner, or try and upsell me on an excessively expensive bottle because they would inaccurately read my accent as American and think that I was a tourist. And so I saw that there was actually a niche opportunity to focus on female producers, and therefore a kind of female-friendly wine environment in English and also French, and to do wine education that wasn't alienating for people, that was just, let me give you some descriptive words so that you know how to get the best bang for your buck when you're at a restaurant or in another wine store. And also the unintended but kind of upside was some in real life community, which everyone was kind of craving in the kind of spring of 2021.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome. And so how long but that was just something you were working on for a couple months, and then you got pulled back into tech. Sounds like, right?
So I ran the store for a couple of years, actually.
Oh, really?
So
Oh, nice.
yeah, we were lucky enough to have Cave Woman for a couple of years. Ultimately, I was working on some tech projects in parallel because it turns out solving not particularly intellectually hard problems meant that I got a little bit bored, not of the project, but just something to occupy the brain. Mm-hmm. Ran it for a couple of years in Paris before we ultimately shut down.
When you get used to like living at a certain pace, or when your brain is used to being challenged, it can be really challenging to slow down and not be able to solve problems. Like I just think back to like just different parts of my adult life where work felt like, okay, things are on track, we have momentum. And then it's like, okay, that's where I notice like, okay, I'm reading more now. Like I'm studying more philosophy. I'm like, there's ways, okay, if I'm doing this and I feel like doing this after work, like I'm not stretching. So it's like, okay, well, what else can I be doing at work to stretch and to make us better and to solve more you know what I mean? Like it's just an interesting, I've just noticed that about myself. It's I never really slow down on problem solving. I just end up like allocating that energy wherever I can. It's I don't know if you, it sounds like you sort of experienced that too. It's like it's hard to slow
It's
down.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I kind of say like creativity or this energy and think it's a little bit kind of like a Labrador puppy. Like either you're going to give it something to do or it's going to find something else to do. And you might not like the outcome. So
Yeah,
it does
yeah,
find it finds an
yeah.
outlet for sure. I
That's
also
a
don't
good
mean to
analogy.
imply I learned everything there was to learn about wine and got bored. But what I did realize is what your average, even your expert consumer needs is this much info.
Yeah.
And once you get into the next phase, you become, in my opinion, kind of insufferable, where you're telling people like details that nobody asked for, and it's very
Yes,
alienating.
I hate that's like the whole concept behind this podcast. Like, like we don't want to be like overly tactically dense where people are just like, God, we don't need to know like every nuanced tactical insight on how to implement an ATS. Like
Yeah,
we could figure it out.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
Okay, so speaking of talent acquisition, let's get into it. So, so I would just love to talk to you about like top lessons, and I know you're in a people role, and it's a little bit more all encompassing. However, you know, we have a lot of there's people leaders, but there's a lot of talent acquisition leaders tuning in too, and mostly startup growth stage and even enterprise, but tech industry. So people, you know, similar to us, right, TA leaders. Um, at this point in your career, I'm curious to get your thoughts on like kind of your top takeaways for talent acquisition. What would you say is like the top lessons learned at this point in your career?
Yeah, I think what's so interesting about talent acquisition is that it really is kind of just about understanding the way people think. And the reason I say that is ideally, if you're at a stage in your career where you've been able to choose the company you work for as opposed to, take the job you could get and things like that, if you are in a talent acquisition role in a company that you believe in for yourself, because that's why you've taken the job, the insight then is to say, why would we're going after the best talent, right? If you're a talent acquisition professional and you don't believe that the company you're at can allow itself to go after the best talent and you're given industry or geography, like there's probably a question there. But that should be our positioning, right? Again, 10,000 caveats, but if we think that we really are the best company and that's where you're spending your career, we should be able to go and get the best candidates. So therefore, the framing of it is not why would somebody join us, but why would the best person, let's take push security, why would the best security researcher in the entire world not want to work for us? And that's that's kind of my mental model, because I do think it
Mm.
really shifts things from, oh my God, how am I going to source candidates, to really kind of centering, okay, before we get into the nitty gritty of, finding, assessing, and then, hiring people, what actually is it we do? Why is that compelling and exciting? Therefore, where are the best people in the industry? And can we work backwards from that? And that is very different to, oh, we just need to hire an account executive who can sell cybersecurity and is based somewhere in Chicago. Because then you kind of start at the end of the game and you go into your LinkedIn or whatever recruiter, which we all do, which is fine, and type your keywords or your AI search and look for people. And then you kind of run down the list in whatever order LinkedIn's given them to you. Maybe they're open to work, and you're like, okay, great. Let's see if I can get this person to interview, meet them. Are they good enough? Let's go. And that's fine because we're usually understaffed. We're almost always understaffed. We're not rewarded necessarily for, finding the needle in the haystack. We're rewarded for closing the role. But I think if at least the mindset is, if I back myself and I'm in this role, why wouldn't other great people join us? It kind of just flips a little bit the order of operations in how you hire.
Yeah, it's being proactive and determining like, okay, what potential blockers are we going to run into?
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know if yeah, that is a really solid way to approach it. Hey, in startup and growth stage environments, like with successful startups growth stage, what do you think the biggest blockers are? I mean, does anything stand out of like what companies typically get wrong there?
Yeah, I
I mean,
think
there's all sorts of stuff. I know that's like a big
yeah.
question, right? But
I think where so caveat, the market right now, early 2026 and late 2025 is insane. I've never seen a market like this, and I've been doing this for a while. And what I mean by that is, last week we lost a candidate who had signed with us, resigned from their old job, and then their former job counted with 100,000 US dollar retention bonus, no strings attached. I've never before seen that in my career. And the more I told that story, the more friends in the industry were like, "Oh, well, actually, in my company, this, or actually over here, this," and so there is just a lot of things that previously weren't even, we would previous wisdom would say, as a talent acquisition professional, you ask upfront in, first screening call. Why are you open to a change? Imagine we go through this process. You're our candidate. We make you an offer in line with your expectations, and your boss counters. What are you going to do? We get people to front load that decision. That goes out the window. 100K to stay. Anybody, you'd
right.
be insane, not to, kind of thing. So I think there are no hard and fast rules, but I think a lot of the reasons, I think the reasons why people join an early stage startup are a little bit misunderstood in the broader, if you haven't done it before, it's a little bit misunderstood in the broader community. Usually people say, okay, you're joining early, you're going to take a below market salary, and your equity will be game changing one day. And that's kind of maybe what people think of. Maybe not, right? Imagine if you're a sort of sales hire, a number 50, maybe your employee number 50 in a kind of, mid-level sales role is actually in an equity attribution model. Is actually that equity going to be game changing? Maybe if you end up, with one of the biggest IPOs, but it might also just be one part of your package. And it might be the fact that actually you're the first person and the only person on the East Coast. And so the entire East Coast revenue is for you. And so your W-2, if we're in the US, W-2, you might be able to make 4x your OTE a couple of years. That's probably going to outweigh the equity payout over 4 years and on that model. So I think there's like a bunch of nuance around the specific role, why you join, even the what you get to work on. I think we're no longer in the model of the larger the company, the bigger your team and department, therefore the more prestige or money or advancement. And often, particularly for talent acquisition, for people in our roles, you're doing a lot more with less. You're often doing the people scope as well as talent acquisition, as well as being the person, if there's a labor issue that goes on, as well as half the time running payroll. So I think it's about really understanding what is the day-to-day like. And if we never get that liquidity event or that equity, why still is this a really good way to spend a couple of years of your career? And I think articulating that stops people from overly focusing on equity, which is never guaranteed, always back of the envelope figures, because we can't predict the future. And I think that helps us weed out in both directions people who will actually thrive and succeed in early stage and people who would be a much better hire in a year. And that's a great, let's stay in touch and, stay where you're at and let's chat later on. So I think it's around that. It's around not drinking so much of your own Kool-Aid that you think everybody should get in at this stage might not be actually the right fit. They might be your best, third person to hire when you've divided the East Coast territory into, Mid-Atlantic and New York City area and things like that.
That's really good insight. Like one way just to simplify and like take out like part of it too is like listening to the market and where it is. Like you can't just like you talk about how the market's different than how you've ever seen it. I feel like I've been saying that for the last like 5 years. And it's just like what is normal? Like what what's going on, right? So it's like constantly shifting. And so it's like listening to the market and where it's at, not just resting on what you learned like 2 years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but staying really close. You gotta constantly be evaluating data and feedback from candidates and like staying really close to what's happening. Like what you were saying that you were talking with your friends and like hearing what they were saying about like what they're seeing on the market with candidates and whatnot. I feel like now more than ever, like you just got to be on it, right? You got to be really plugged into what's going on.
Yeah, and I think also like ask the question. I see sometimes people earlier in their careers, recruiters and things like that, where they go, "Oh, I don't think the candidate will accept if this," and I'm like, "Oh, let's just ask. Like, let's
Yeah,
just say,
right.
hey,
Go for it.
here's where we're at, and here's the
What do you think?
here's the math we're running. is this a deal breaker or not? Like, let's not sit with these, oh, I don't think, or that. Like, particularly in early stage, you can really get away with just being like, hey, we've not done this before. Are you open to this?
Yeah, and I do that. I do that a lot. Like I frankly, I have a lot of like conversation with like for my embedded recruiting RPO firm. A lot of it are scale ups, and just kind of teaching this like just talk to the candidate about like even before making the offer, like, hey, we're thinking about making an offer here. Like, what do you think? Is this something you would accept? Right?
Yeah,
Okay, no. So like, well, let's talk about that. If you wouldn't accept them, why? And so what would it take to get you to accept before we go to the work of putting together all that? Like, let's just talk about it and figure it out. Okay, so you're
yeah,
saying XYZ, if we got to this place and you had these things, would you accept at that point? Yeah. Okay, great. Let's see if we can make that happen now, right? I mean, it's like just like I always see it and I talk to candidates about this too, like even with folks that are joining my companies, it's like, hey, the offer process, the interview, this is the first project we're working on together. This is an opportunity to see how we work together as
yeah,
partners in the business. It's so that we're going to work. We are working together already, and this is a process to see if we're going to continue to. And so it's like thinking about it from that mindset of like I actually use it as like part of an honestly even part of an evaluation process. Like, hey, what do you want? Like, let's see if there's alignment. What in having like more of an offer conversation versus like evaluation than hey, we're just going to present something. It's like no, let's talk. Let's have a conversation about it. Um,
yeah.
I found that to be like really helpful in making me make. Also, it also kind of you can get a sense for people's business and strategic acumen and for their comfort level of like having executive level conversations and like just these types. I think it's really helpful to get a sense for how people think too.
Yeah,
Personally,
absolutely. And,
so
and and you always have to extrapolate signals from the hiring process in any case.
yeah,
There's like old adages that a sales candidate who doesn't negotiate their offer isn't a good sale. And it's like, well, sure, if you've never present, if your company strategy is to go low so that they negotiate high, sure, I would expect that. But if you've been transparent through the process, here's what our account executives make in this region. Here's where the OT would be. Here's the benefits. Here's the equity, and it's based on a mathematical model. Here, how does that align from sort of conversation one and throughout the process checking in? Do you have other offers that you're comparing us against? Okay, great. We wouldn't be able to get to the OTE. Where we would have wiggle room might be on, the ramp, or it might be on, a recoverable signing bonus, or it might be here. I think like people can accept a lot of things if you're transparent. The worst thing you could do would be to say this is best and final, and then they get in and they see that they're a person, across the state in a neighboring territory. They talk and they find out, well, actually, they managed to push the OT up. I think it's, people will remember kind of the meta conversation, which is, were they transparent? Were they helpful? Was everybody kind of on the same side of this? Or were there some cheap tactics to save 10 grand here or there? And in which case, I think that's where you then end up with more of that individualism than you're looking for. So yeah, I think as transparent as possible, which is, sometimes
it's
easier said.
transparency. It's also being like buttoned up, like everything you were just saying. It's like there's a lot that goes into it, and knowing and having a strong enough alignment with the leadership team internally to be able to present like with that level of granularity in terms of like, okay, we can't budge here, but we can do this, and there's just different parameters that we can work within, and we'll work with you, but let's get ahead of this just so and setting those expectations. Like reality is like not a lot of teams do operate that in the scale up space. It's like they're just not, and it's sometimes to I don't want to say no fault to their own, but I mean they're just like they're still growing, like they're still figuring stuff out,
Yeah.
right? So you do
It's
see
never
it,
going to be
right?
perfect
Right.
because like you also have to play to your advantage, and your advantage of being smaller and more agile is that you can sometimes go outside of band, or you can sometimes do a
Right.
thing. One of the things I think is still true is that, if all of a sudden somebody had access to everyone's comp data, can you at least explain the decisions, and are you comfortable with it? And even if people aren't happy with it, if you're comfortable as the CEO, or as the VP of people, or as the VP of finance, or whatever that looks like, if you're comfortable with that, then fine, you're running things correctly. And I always have that back of mind. I always sort of say, look, let's assume that these two people speak to each other. Can I justify that gap? If I'm comfortable, let's go.
Agreed.
Rather than keep everything equal, if because performance in startups isn't equal. That's the whole point. Outsized performance, outsized
Yeah, but
reward.
it's his performance. Like I do the parallel to like professional sports teams all the time.
Yeah,
Like not everybody's paid the same. Like how valuable of a player are you? Like
yeah,
straight up. I mean, there is that, but of course there are salary bands across like position. I do advocate for those as well. Um, but I think it's like well, then it's like, okay, if there's discrepancies, you have salary bands for the same position, but you see different levels of talent based on whatever. It's like, okay, well, then maybe you need tiers for a certain role so that you can equitably say, okay, there's a reason why they're at a higher tier. But then again, you
Yeah.
don't necessarily see that level of sophistication it's just
I
like
think
a little more mature than,
Yeah, I think you can operate with principles before you have to kind of hard code it into models.
yeah,
And that can be things like, as long as there's something that makes them exceptional, we can go up, you know, plus 10% without it needing to be, you know, like a
right.
three tiered approval, you know, and then once every 6 months, do we run our eyes over it and go, yeah, actually we need to fix that or not? You know, it might just be that level of it. I think as long as there's
Yeah.
like principles, and that can be as simple as, you know, I mean, everyone runs it differently. Our offer approval process is a,
Yeah,
you
I
know,
think like
upload on Slack, you
what
know.
to avoid is like they just negotiated better. Like there needs to be value like behind it.
Yeah,
Otherwise, like you got to hold firm to, I mean, that's just sort of like, that's just going to break trust. Like, again, as you said, like people cannot like decisions, but, if somebody brings a specific type of experience or skill set or expertise to the table, or, from a
yeah,
performance standpoint, like whatever. I mean, you can be a little like, you could use it's one based more situational. You can
yeah.
be a little more situational, I think, but right, there should be some kind of like, just the logic of they pushed back. And so we had to do, I mean, that's not how business should be run at any level.
Yeah. No, and I think like also it probably is indicative that we weren't doing our job. If we didn't get until like the 11th hour of the pushback, like why we pre-qualified, we pre-closed, why is this coming up? And sometimes the answer is, hey, I got this other offer. And you go, okay, great. Like you told me your decision criteria were these things. You told us that we stacked up better versus them. I'm going to leave it with you. This is the offer, you know, think it over, but come back to us. And if not, we're going to move forward, you know. And I think it comes down to, and this is really tricky in high growth startups where you're understaffed, you don't often have, you know, even if you have the agency or external budget, you don't always have the partners that you would choose for yourself. And, yeah, you know, there's a bunch of forces at play there. You have to have an abundance mindset around talent because, and that's kind of where what I was driving at around why wouldn't the best people in the world join us rather than, oh my God, if we lose this person, we don't have backup candidates. And it's like, well, hold on, have we exhausted the entire talent market in that geography? Like, are we in a position where truly we believe it's scarce, or truly we believe that we're going to keep losing out at offer because of XYZ? Like, let's run the experiment of, hey, are we missing something? Has the market shifted since we last hired here, and actually we are undercutting everyone, and therefore, you know, we do need to level up the budgets? Great, we can very easily figure that out. Or is it more, you know, pushing back against that eternal thing? It's better to have a role sitting open than to have the wrong person in it for 3 4 months while you figure it out. And that is very easy to say, but very difficult to get, you know, whether it's your CRO or, you know, another leader like really bought into that when they're just seeing, you know, yield spreadsheets or things that need to be filled. So, but I do still think largely an abundance mindset. If it's not this person, we'll get someone better, and that's fine. Obviously, backed up by some hustle to say, now we're going to go run and refill pipeline on that. But I think if you have a scarcity mindset on talent, you're setting yourself up for a bit of a world of pain, which is because we're an early startup, because of XYZ, we can only aim for this kind of level of
It's a
talent.
terrible way to goal set. Like
Yeah,
I mean, that's just like one of my kind of pet peeves. I mean, I always set incredibly ambitious goals, and I've always looked at it from the perspective of like, okay, this is the goal. It's not changing. What might change is the approach to get there. So, like my job, I see everything as like an equation, right? Like there's a formula to get to where we want to be. So, like let's set the outcome we need to achieve, and let's work backward to figure out what the formula is.
yeah,
We're just going to continue to iterate and change until we get there. I mean, I think it's like the same thing when holding. It's like maintaining high standards and being incredibly persistent when it comes to achieving our goals, but flexible in how we get there
yeah,
is a really important, just like general principle in life, like
yeah.
just for
No,
everything. Like, you know what I mean? It's like funny. It's like we're talking about like earlier, just talking about before we recorded about how you kind of operate in a startup sort of like bleeds over into other areas of your life. And you were talking about like some of those different things. I forget exactly what you were saying, but you were talking about how like your career definitely has influenced different ways how you operate just in your life. Can you remind me like what were some of those top ways that present?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's like around like efficiency or the
Mhm.
fact that hard things are figure outable. You know, I moved to the US a year and a half ago. Obviously, not an expert in US taxes or what I need to do. I know that you can't really do them yourself, and that's a kind of flaw in the US system, but at the very least, trying to sort of figure out, hey, have I done all the right paperwork? What are the dates? What are the things? Like, when am I likely to have to pay? Are they going to refund me? What are the implications? I have, tax residency, in various places. That can be incredibly overwhelming. But if I frame it as a personal problem, I'm like, oh my God, that's exhausting and something I have to do after work. And if I just apply my startup brain and I'm like, imagine it was an employee who's just moved to the US and like, oh my God, I don't know. I'm like, what would I actually do? What would be the checklist? And it's so much easier then to just kind of
That's
frame it.
smart.
So yeah, I think it's just like the ability to break down something where, if somebody said to me, hey, we've got an employee labor law case in, let's say, what's a country I've never operated in, Romania, and sorry, you weren't here when we hired the person, and the contract's somewhere, and anyway, we're probably going to get sued. Can you figure it out? Do I have any specific expertise for that? Absolutely not. Leave me until the end of business, and I'll at least know the edges of the problem. And then I think what that then can sort of look like, good and bad in your sort of personal life and thing, is just like an extreme efficiency. Like the amount of things I can get done on a Saturday just because of kind of like the way my weekdays are scheduled in half-hour increments, and context switching is, I have a logical path for if I've got to run these 4 errands and then see this friend and then do this, here's the order of events and here's what I'm going to, do in parallel and things like that, to my own detriment. Like I have to then, maybe put a 3-hour block on a Sunday morning in my calendar to say, do not book, actively relax, read book in bed or something, so it really does have a downside. I think if you're used to,
Funny.
this like high velocity operating, but I think on the upside, I've moved countries twice, relatively complex visas, back to the earlier point for the United States, Australians, at least currently, can get work visas if you have a job offer, a bachelor's degree, and a wage above the prevailing minimums. I don't have a bachelor's degree. I'm still here on that visa because there are ways to figure it out, which is, I now have an honorary bachelor's degree of 12 years of professional, experience equivalency through, that's not the default path, but there's almost always another path if you want to figure it out. So yeah, I think there's a everything solvable kind of approach. But yeah, a lot of downsides. Much like all those memes around, they can be a little bit gendered, but sometimes it's like, oh, when I'm talking to my boyfriend and I don't want a solution, I just want, empathy. Startup people can be like that. We're like solutions first. I'm like, oh, wait,
Yeah.
here, I can solve that with a checklist. And sometimes the
Right.
checklist is not.
Oh, that
What,
was definitely something
right.
I had to learn. Like
Yeah.
all of my relationships. Um, yeah. The other thing that I think I just had this realization, and it was because I was at dinner with a buddy, who's also like head of TA for an incredibly successful scale up, and we both figured out that we like evaluate everything that we buy in our personal life like way too much. And we were thinking about it, I was like, oh, it's probably because we're in talent acquisition and our job is literally evaluation all freaking day. And it's like this double-edged sword. Like I can't buy anything without doing like a put on a research, trying to back channel, look at the reviews. Okay, with those like marketing sponsored reviews, like going into like these feature sets, doing an analysis side by side. And it's just like it's like a $30 like I like just buy the damn thing. Like it doesn't need to be like, the best
Definitely.
one in the world, right? Like you don't need the best like wrench or some random crap. It's just like I definitely do that. I think it does kind of bleed over, right? Like the different things.
100. I
Yeah.
mean, 100%. And
Yeah.
even the, understanding other people, you'll note it amongst friends, and kind of say, oh, actually, like, what do you do for work? And then they'll start with something really vague and you'll be like, yeah, no, you can go into details because every
Right.
other
I
day
got
I've
it. Yeah.
got a brand new job I've never heard of. And, the questions to ask to be interesting. And yeah, like, I do think there's a certain automation even around like how to dive in and figure out what, makes people tick. And I do think it generally, not always true, but it does generally make people also like to be around you and you ask good questions and people are
Yeah.
kind of like, oh geez, yeah, had a great conversation. And they asked and you're just like, oh, I wasn't even, my brain wasn't even particularly on. I was just sort of, running through the program, but it has
It's so
good flow
sad.
on effects.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. Well, anyways, yeah, I actually find that really interesting too. I think for me, interestingly enough, like at the beginning of my career, early 20s, work always made more sense to me than my personal life. I don't know why,
Yeah.
but the way my brain was wired is like work was my comfort zone. but it's interesting. It's like I do think a lot of the communication skills I developed at work, I've been able to figure out how to translate and be like better personally at relationships and communication and being engaging. And like it took me a while, frankly. I think I've got in there. I don't know. You'll have to ask my
Yeah.
friends, but you know, but it's just like one of those things. It's like I guess people kind of take different paths and they have different like comfort zones and different. But again, it's like I think it's about taking what we've learned and learning how to apply it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
100%.
yeah, yeah. Well, hey, I did want to talk to you about like do- just like professionally, who do you want to become? Like, how do you see yourself developing over the next several years? Like, really, what do you want to double down on at this point?
Yeah. Yeah, I think what's interesting is about companies in general, but startups in particular, is influence. And I don't mean this in a iron fist, get to be the decision maker to have the power and things like that. But I think the more you understand, whether whether you're a recruiter early career or whether you're sort of spanning a lot of different functions on the people side, I think the more you understand about what matters to a CEO, what matters to investors, what matters to the board, and how they think about things and how they frame problem solutions, spend, budget, things like that, the more indispensable you become in an organization. And the number one thing, quite naturally end up being a kind of source of advice for my friends and things for any and all work troubles. People come to me and say, "Oh, I don't get it. My boss did this or asked for this, and then changed their mind about that." And the number one thing I say is like, step back. Like, what do you think they're getting from above, or do you understand what their boss wants from them? Do you understand what your boss, what is their bonus based on? How do they succeed? How can what you're doing basically map to that? And I'll get some pushback, right, from friends outside of tech or startups, where they'll say, yeah, but like jobs should be like this, and not, and I kind of say, well, sure, that maybe they should be, but in reality this is probably what's going on, and if you do this, that's going to be seen this way, and therefore you'll succeed. And I think a lot of that translation layer from what does the CEO care about? What is he hearing from the investors and board? What is he hearing from customers? What is the future of our product? What is the future of our market? I think the more you can kind of understand cross functionally inside and outside of the company, the more you can really influence and have levers and basically draw a much straighter line from the stuff that fills your calendar and your day, a day to day, and the actual results of the company financially, which if you are a stock option holder, which you would be if you're in an early stage startup, you have that kind of agency over the result. So I think for me, what's really interesting is your influence over the outcome and being ever more, I guess, embedded in the various parts to understand. Because and then I think if you're doing any kind of talent acquisition, if you start from really deeply understanding the business and what matters, you are then going to be the person who can spot the difference between someone who's going to fill a role and someone who is going to really be game changing for the company, right? Which, particularly if you're talking about technical roles, I spent a lot of my earlier career hiring engineers and machine learning and things like that. Well, before that was really sort of a more commonly understood thing. I just asked an endless amount of dumb questions of people in my network or people inside the company, or to figure out how do I work out what an engineer can influence or not, which I think to this day is the thing that helps me, sort of spot someone that we should pull out all the stops for, to say, hey, that person over there, did you see what we need to go and get them because X, Y, Z will unlock this. And that thing we were talking about 2 months ago, I think we could move it up by a quarter if we get this person. And here's how I think we'll get them because of X, Y, Z trend, right? And I think it's that, like, that's what's interesting to me, what makes the company succeed. And so I think the
Yeah.
actual format of it, who knows, it might look very different depending on stage, but that understanding how to make a company successful and then being a key driver of it.
Yeah, it's really well said. I completely agree, and I that's something I talk about all the time. I don't have anything to add to what you said because it was well said. I mean, you said it. I think you got it all in. So, but I couldn't agree more with you. And I think that's like a big part of what it takes to become a successful executive, to be like top of your field, to
Yeah.
truly be excellent. All right, we talked about excellence earlier, but
Yeah, absolutely.
well, hey, Allison, we're running up on time here. I've had a really fun time talking with you today. And you packed a lot of really insightful information into this episode that I know our audience is really going to value. And it's just also been like really fun getting to know you as well. So thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, same here, James. Thanks so much for having me.